So dear students, let us continue with the development of urinary system. In previous session, we have seen the development of kidneys and ureters and their congenital anomalies, and in today's session, we would learn about the urinary bladder and urethra. So let's talk about the urinary bladder in the beginning. So urinary bladder is formed from the upper portion of urogenital sinus, which is a part of endodermal cloaca, and it is the continuation of allantois. So if you see the cloaca is the lower part of hindgut. So hindgut is divided into two parts by the attachment of allantois. So here is the allantois. In adults it forms the urachus and median umbilical ligament. And because of urorectal septum, this is the septum which is growing in between the primitive rectum and urogenital sinus. So this urorectal septum divides the post-allantoic part. Post-allantoic part is the dilated endodermal cloaca, and this post-allantoic part is divided into anterior urogenital sinus, so ventral or the anterior side urogenital sinus, and dorsal primitive rectum. So primitive rectum you might have seen along with the development of hindgut, where we see the rectum and a part of anal canal develops from primitive rectum. So in this topic we are interested about the urogenital sinus, which forms the urinary bladder. So the cloaca is divided into two parts by mesodermal urorectal septum, and which is formed during 4th to 7th week of development. So the ventral part forms the urogenital sinus and dorsal part forms the primitive rectum. So the tip of the urorectal septum forms the perineal body. So this urorectal septum, which grows down further till the perineum, and it joins here to form perineal body. So perineal body in adults it forms. So the cloacal membrane also divides into anal membrane posteriorly and urogenital membrane anteriorly. So here is the cloacal membrane. So this part of the membrane which covers the primitive rectum is the anal membrane. And the membrane which covers the lower opening of the urogenital sinus is the urogenital membrane. So the mesonephric duct now opens into the primitive urogenital sinus. So this is the mesonephric duct. So which is divisible into two parts because of the opening of mesonephric duct. So this is the ureteric bud, which is from the mesonephric duct. So the mesonephric ducts now opens into the urogenital sinus, dividing the urogenital sinus into two parts. The part above the opening of the mesonephric duct, it is called as vesico-urethral canal. So from here to here is the vesico-urethral canal. And the part which is below the opening of mesonephric ducts is called as definitive urogenital sinus. So the definitive urogenital sinus can be further divided into two parts. The cranial pelvic part is which is present in the pelvis, and the caudal part is called phallic part. So the upper part is the pelvic part. This part is further divided into two parts. So this is the pelvic part. And caudal phallic part. So the allantois opens at the cranial end of vesico-urethral canal. So you can see the allantoic diverticulum which opens into the vesico-urethral canal and where it forms urachus in adults. The upper larger part of the vesico-urethral canal expands while its lower part remains narrow. So you can see the vesico-urethral canal, the cranial part of it or the upper part of it gets dilated to form the urinary bladder, where the lower part gets narrow. It remains narrow to form the neck of the urinary bladder. So upper large dilated part of the vesico-urethral canal forms the urinary bladder, and it is continuing with the allantois at its apex. So apex, you can see it is continuing with the allantois. So here is the allantoic diverticulum. The allantois obliterates and forms a fibrous band called as urachus, which extends from the apex of the urinary bladder to the umbilicus. So the urachus is later called as median umbilical ligament in adult. The lower narrow part of the vesico-urethral canal forms the primitive urethra. So the narrow part of the vesico-urethral canal which forms the primitive urethra. So the parts of the mesonephric duct distal to the ureteric buds are now absorbed into the wall of vesico-urethral canal. So you can see the mesonephric duct starts getting absorbed into the wall of vesico-urethral canal. So here is a schematic image for us to understand again. So this is the urogenital sinus which forms the vesico-urethral canal, and which again has the dilated part which forms the major part of the urinary bladder, and narrow constricted part which forms the primitive urethra. And this is allantois which forms the urachus, and it later turns to form median umbilical ligament. And this is primitive rectum. And here is the anal membrane. This is urogenital membrane. And in between it is the urorectal septum. And here is the mesonephric duct. And this is the ureteric bud, which is arising from the mesonephric duct. So most of the mesonephric duct, means from here to here till the opening of the ureteric bud, it starts getting absorbed into the vesico-urethral canal. That is, starts getting absorbed into the developing urinary bladder. So as a result, the mesonephric duct and ureters now open separately into the vesico-urethral canal. So initially there is a common opening of it. So as it gets absorbed, the mesonephric duct, we can see the mesonephric duct is separated from the ureteric opening. So in this image we can see the mesonephric duct, it is already separated from the ureteric opening. So this is the ureteric opening which is surrounded by the metanephric blastema which forms the kidneys, and you can see the mesonephric duct which is grey in color opening separately into the vesico-urethral canal here. So here is a schematic image for us to understand how the mesonephric ducts and the ureteric openings become separate. So initially this is the common mesonephric duct, and this is the ureteric bud, this is the ureteric bud, and this is the mesonephric duct. And we can see as the mesonephric duct gets absorbed, we can see the mesonephric ducts are now separated. And here is the opening of ureteric. openings. So these are the openings of ureters. So when we see the interior of the urinary bladder, initially the mesonephric duct and the opening of the ureters, they lie closer to each other. So you can see the opening of the ureters and mesonephric ducts. They open separately into the vesico-urethral canal, but they are quite closer to each other. Now at this point we have to know about the development of trigone of urinary bladder. So due to the absorption of mesonephric ducts into the vesico-urethral canal, the mesonephric ducts and the ureteric buds now have a separate opening into the vesico-urethral canal or primitive urinary bladder. So at first, the openings of mesonephric ducts and the ureteric buds are close together. You can see they are close together. But later, the openings of the ureteric buds move cranially and laterally. So ureteric buds move cranially and laterally. So we can see the ureteric bud opening and the mesonephric duct opening, they are quite far apart. So here, because of the absorption of mesonephric duct, it creates a triangular area on the dorsal wall of vesico-urethral canal between the openings of ureteric buds and the mesonephric ducts. This triangular area is called as trigone of urinary bladder. So whatever is shown in dotted part is the trigone of urinary bladder. So this trigone of urinary bladder is derived from the absorption of mesonephric ducts. So one thing we have to note here, the proximal part of the mesonephric duct or the Wolffian duct, it forms the ductal system in male genital system. So they form the conduit for sperms from the testis to the urethra, and it gives rise to epididymis, ductus deferens, seminal vesicle, common ejaculatory duct. In females, these ducts regress completely. And let's see the development of coats of urinary bladder. The epithelial lining of the whole of the urinary bladder is derived from the endodermal vesico-urethral canal, which is a part of cloaca, except this trigone, that is the internal triangular area. So the trigone of the urinary bladder, which is present on the dorsal wall of the urinary bladder, is derived from the mesoderm, because it is derived from the absorbed part of mesonephric duct. So that is the reason it is derived from the mesoderm. The rest of the urinary bladder, the epithelial lining is from the endodermal vesico-urethral canal. And the muscular and the serous coats of the urinary bladder are derived from the splanchnopluric intraembryonic mesoderm. So let's talk about the summary of development of urinary bladder. So the cranial dilated part of the vesico-urethral canal. So the cranial dilated part of the vesico-urethral canal, it forms the endodermal epithelial lining, the whole of the urinary bladder except at the region of trigone. And absorption of the mesonephric ducts forms the trigone. So absorption of the mesonephric ducts in the dorsal wall of the vesico-urethral canal results in the formation of mesodermal epithelial lining in the region of trigone of urinary bladder. Splanchnopluric intraembryonic mesoderm surrounding the vesico-urethral canal forms the muscular and the serous coats of urinary bladder. And allantois results in the formation of urachus, which is otherwise called as median umbilical ligament, which connects from the apex of the urinary bladder to the umbilicus. So let's discuss about some congenital anomalies associated with the development of urinary bladder. So congenital anomalies of urachus. So the urachus in adult like it is called as median umbilical ligament, which is the derivative of allantois. Normally, it obliterates to form a fibrous cord in adults called as median umbilical ligament. So, here it is not obliterated, so it results in the form of urachal sinus or urachal fistula. Urachal sinus, if the lumen persists in the upper part of the urachus, that is close to the umbilicus, and it is called as urachal sinus. So, only in the near the umbilicus it is patent, and rest of it is obliterated. So, if it is patent only in this part, it is called as urachal sinus. The next condition is urachal fistula. If the lumen persists along the entire length of the extent, so as shown here in this image, if the lumen is persisting from here to here, it is called as urachal fistula. So, persist in the entire length of the urachus, which results in fistula. So, the urachal fistula opens into the urinary bladder at one end and at the umbilicus on the other end. So, as the reason, the urine is discharged through the umbilicus. So, you can see the urine dribbles out through the umbilical opening. So, the next condition is the urachal cyst. If only small part of the urachus remains patent, the secretory activity of its lining epithelium leads to the formation of cyst dilatation called as urachal cyst. So, it is obliterated near the umbilicus and it is obliterated near the urinary bladder. So, somewhere in between, if it is patent, having a fluid inside it, which is called as urachal cyst. So, these are the conditions which are associated with the urachus. Next condition is ectopia vesicae. In this condition, the lower median part of the anterior abdominal wall and anterior wall of the urinary bladder is absent. So, the mucosal surface of the posterior wall of the urinary bladder showing the ureteric orifices is exposed to the surface. So, this anomaly occurs due to the lack of migration of mesoderm in the lateral folds of the embryo. So, the mesoderm fails to migrate in the lateral folds of the embryo. So, because of the deficiency of the mesoderm, the infra-umbilical part of the anterior abdominal wall is deficient, and also the anterior wall of the urinary bladder is also deficient. So, the embryo in the hypogastric region below the umbilicus, we can see the urinary bladder is exposed out. So, normally during lateral folding of the embryo, the lateral folds are formed and they grow medially and fuse with each other. So, the mesoderm migrates in these lateral folds and forms the muscles of the anterior abdominal wall. The anterior abdominal wall muscles are not fused in the hypogastric region. So, in ectopic vesicae, what happens? The anterior abdominal wall muscles are not formed, and especially in the hypogastric region between the umbilicus and the genital tubercle. So, as a result, the surface ectoderm comes in contact with the endoderm of vesico-urethral canal, which is the future urinary bladder. The ectoderm and the endoderm breaks down and the posterior wall of the urinary bladder is exposed onto the surface. So, the urine can be seen dribbling intermittently from these ureteric orifices. So, that is about the ectopic vesicae. So, let us move on to the development of urethra. So, first we shall begin with the development of female urethra. Female urethra is short and its development is very simple because the female urethra corresponds to the prostatic part of male urethra and it is above the colliculus seminalis. That is, it is a landmark distal to the entrance of ejaculatory ducts. So, the whole of the female urethra is endodermal in origin, which is derived from the urogenital sinus, except at its dorsal wall, that is it is mesodermal in origin, which is derived from the absorption of mesonephric ducts. So, the whole female urethra develops from a narrow caudal part of vesico-urethral canal. except a small terminal part which develops from the pelvic part of definitive urogenital sinus. So the phallic part of the definitive urogenital sinus forms the vestibule of vagina into which the urethra opens. So the phallic part forms the vestibule. So this is the vestibule, which is derived from the phallic part. And here is the opening of urethra in females. And here is the opening of vaginal opening. And this is the anal opening. So this is about the development of female urethra. So now we shall start with the development of male urethra. Male urethra is divided into three parts: prostatic part, membranous part and spongy part. Prostatic part, it is the part of urethra above the openings of ejaculatory ducts. So here is the opening of mesonephric duct, which forms the opening of ejaculatory ducts in adults, and it develops from the caudal part of vesico-urethral canal. So below the opening of the mesonephric duct. So that is the caudal part of the vesico-urethral canal will form the prostatic part of urethra. So the posterior wall of this prostatic part, it is derived from the absorbed mesonephric duct. So the posterior wall is from the absorbed mesonephric duct, and the part of the prostatic part below the openings of ejaculatory duct develops from the upper pelvic part of definitive urogenital sinus. So this is the urogenital sinus. From here to here is the urogenital sinus. So which gives rise to the prostatic part below the opening of ejaculatory ducts. Okay, the second part is the membranous urethra. This is a small part of urethra, lies in deep perineal pouch. So it develops from the lower pelvic part of definitive urogenital sinus. So I'll explain. This is definitive urogenital sinus. It is below the opening of ejaculatory ducts, which are nothing but the mesonephric ducts during fetal life. And the upper part of the definitive urogenital sinus contributes in the formation of prostatic part of urethra. And lower part of definitive urogenital sinus will form the membranous part of urethra. And prostatic part also develops from the absorbed part of mesonephric duct. So the posterior wall of prostatic part of the urethra is derived from the absorbed part of mesonephric duct. So that is about the prostatic part and membranous part of urethra. So the third part is the spongy part of urethra. It is the part of urethra that lies in the bulb. So it is called as bulbar part, and shaft of penis, which is called as penile part. So this is the bulbar part of urethra. This is penile part. So both these parts are derived from the phallic part of definitive urogenital sinus. So if you see the urogenital sinus, definitive urogenital sinus, it has got the upper pelvic part and lower phallic part. So the lower phallic part of definitive urogenital sinus gives rise to spongy part of urethra. Except the terminal part of the urethra, the terminal part of the urethra which lies in glans penis, which is called as the glandular part, it is derived from the surface ectoderm. So only this part of urethra is derived from surface ectoderm. Which is called as glandular part. Penile and bulbar parts are derived from the phallic part of urogenital sinus. So only the lining epithelium of the urethra is derived from the endoderm of urogenital sinus. So the connective tissues and smooth muscles of urethra are derived from the surrounding splanchnopluric layer of intraembryonic mesoderm. So let's look about the summary of development of male and female urethra. So starting with the female urethra. Female urethra, it corresponds to prostatic part of male urethra. So it develops from the caudal part of vesico-urethral canal, and also it develops from the pelvic part of definitive urogenital sinus. So it develops from two sources. Caudal part of vesico-urethral canal, that is the lowermost part of urogenital sinus, is the caudal part of vesico-urethral canal. The other is the pelvic part of definitive urogenital sinus. In male urethra, we know it has got three parts. Prostatic part, that is above to the level of opening of ejaculatory ducts or colliculus seminalis, develops from the caudal part of vesico-urethral canal, and below to the level of openings of ejaculatory ducts develops from the pelvic part of definitive urogenital canal. And membranous part, that is the second part, develops from the pelvic part of definitive urogenital canal, that is the lower part of definitive pelvic urogenital sinus. So after membranous part, the third part would be the spongy part. The spongy part is we further divide into bulbar, penile and all. So penile part is from the phallic part of definitive urogenital sinus, whereas the terminal most part, which occupies the glans penis, it is derived from the surface ectoderm. So penile and bulbar parts, we know it develops from the phallic part of urogenital sinus. So this completes the development of male urethra. So let us see congenital anomaly which is associated with the development of male urethra, which is called as hypospadias. Hypospadias is the most common congenital urethral anomaly in males, and it's sometimes associated with other urogenital abnormalities. So here in this condition, the urethral meatus is located on the ventral surface, anywhere from the penile shaft to penoscrotal region. So you can see it is located on the ventral surface from the penile shaft till penoscrotal region, we can see. So this condition is called as hypospadias. So this is one of the congenital anomaly most commonly associated with the development of male urethra. So this completes the development of urinary system. Thank you.